All right, the Indian Prime Minister's whirlwind European tour comes in the backdrop of a war raging in Ukraine, which has entered its third straight month. Modi has a packed itinerary during the 65-hour trip, with as many as 25 meetings with 8 world leaders. And much of the hard work will go towards finding a way to deal with the Ukraine war and the Russian conundrum. European powers firmly believe that India, with its steadfast neutral stand on Ukraine, is in a position to influence Moscow. India has withstood pressure from anti-Russian axis and continued its meager oil imports from Russia, which is much less than what the West imports. India has also unequivocally sought end to the war while stopping shortage of actual slamming Russia. I want to connect right now to Geeta, and we'll cut across to my colleague Anjana as well. Anjana reports out of Berlin. Geeta's joining me, getting us the very latest from Russia occupation of Ukraine. Geeta, you know, all of this visit happens in the backdrop of where you are right now, with a war which is raging between Russia and Ukraine. How does that play out in what has been, in the last 3 months, immense diplomatic pressure on India to conform to a particular diplomatic line?
Well, Preeti, the visit comes at a very important juncture. Although it was a visit that was planned, the Germany visit, that's the first part of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's tour, is to begin with and to hold the 6th intergovernmental consultations between India and Germany. So a scheduled visit, but comes at a juncture where Germany, then Denmark, and then France, all the countries are going to look at India and look to India as to what India is going to do with regards to Russia and Ukraine. But Preeti, like we've seen in the visits in the past, where so many leaders have come down to New Delhi, had come down to New Delhi, and impressed upon India the need to take a side, India has made it very clear that India's strategic interests do not lie in taking a side, but rather understanding the larger picture and perspective as to what is really happening between Russia and Ukraine. Russia's concerns also have been taken into account by India, and when the conversations take place, no invasion can really be justified. But when the conversation takes place for India, India will again send out the very same message that strategic interests, economic interests are paramount for India, and India has actually suffered the brunt of the West not standing by India after the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So India does not want to be caught in that space yet again, and is the reason why they will continue also. Historic strategic ties between Russia and India cannot be ignored. So yes, that will certainly be a huge part of the conversations that will take place between German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Prime Minister Narendra Modi today. But India has already put forth its stand and will continue to maintain that.
You know, Geeta, stay on with me. We're also going to be connected by my colleague Abhishek Bhalla, who's also reporting and getting us the very latest from Ukraine. But meanwhile, India today spoke to the foreign minister of Russia and Ukraine. Listen into this.
Speaking of India, India is under immense pressure to sever ties, to cut down imports of energy, of fuel. But India has stood its ground. In terms of reliability, is there a concern that India should have with regards to the kind of defense cooperation both countries have? Could there be delays in deliveries of critical weapon systems that India is buying from Russia, such as the S-400s? What is the conversation that you've been having with New Delhi on this front?
Well, India is our very, very old friend. We called our relationship long ago strategic partnership. Then, about 20 years ago, the Indian friends said, why don't we call it privileged strategic partnership? And sometime later they said, not enough. Let's call it especially privileged strategic partnership. This is the unique description of any bilateral relations, I think, of India and of Russia. And with India, we have, long before all this became such a hot potato, we supported Prime Minister Narendra Modi's concept, Make in India, and we started, substituting the simple trade with local production, shifting production of the goods needed by India on your territory. And it was for quite a number of years already that we have been promoting the use of our national currencies in settlements between the companies of two countries and the governments of two countries, promoting the national financial information systems, transmission systems, when you like SWIFT, you know, but you have your own, we have our own, and they're being used more and more. Payment cards, we have MIR system, you have RuPay. They are mutually supportive, and it's not, you know, huge percentage of the overall volume of trade, but it is steadily growing. And on defense, we can provide anything India wants, and the technology transfer in the context of defense cooperation is absolutely unprecedented for any of India's outside partners.
Now, what would you like, therefore, India to do? Because India says, this is not a war we started. We've had, as you said, a special relationship with Russia. We have a good relationship with Ukraine. We want to stay neutral. We do not want to be seen to be taking one side. We want the wars to stop. That's what the Indian Prime Minister has said. We want the fighting to stop. We want peace to return. What would you like India to do more beyond that?
We appreciate the sympathy coming from the leadership of India to Ukraine. We also appreciate the position of India that the war must stop. At the same time, I cannot but mention that under these circumstances, neutrality is the position that doesn't help stopping the war. The best way to stop the war is to support Ukraine and to leave Russia with no illusions that it may win the war, because other countries will either stay neutral, not get involved in it, or somehow will support Russia. So in my view, in a situation when you have an obvious criminal and a victim of his crime, it's a moral and politically wise duty to be on the side of the victim.
So what you're saying is India should isolate Russia totally. You know that India is dependent on Russia for defense equipment. We have strong ties, economic ties, oil, gas, energy. You're saying isolate Russia completely, because India will turn around and say, look, the same Western nations that call for sanctions continue, parts of Europe continue to deal for their energy needs with Russia. So you're calling for a total isolation of Russia. India will turn around and say, well, the West must also walk the talk on that, Mr. Foreign Minister.
Well, the West is not only talking the talk about the isolation of Russia, it's also walking the walk. It has done a lot so far. My second point is that India is a big democratic country. And it would be more than natural for India to stand by democracies in this struggle, because the war between Russia and Ukraine is also a war between democratic world and an authoritarian regime. So I think it would be the most natural choice for India to stand by democracies, not by the other side. When it comes to military cooperation, according to the information that I possess, Russia is not as reliable supplier of defense equipment to India as one might think. There are many issues related to it. And then be pragmatic, look at the battlefield. Ukraine effectively destroys the most advanced Russian weapons on the battleground. So the question is it really in the interests of India to buy weapons which do not survive on the battleground from an army not as advanced as the Russian one? And finally, trade and economic relations. India is a global power. India has future in the world. India is on the rise. Russia is in decline. Choosing the right trade partners, strategic trade partners, is something that will make India even stronger. Yes, you have to reorient some of your trade flows. You have to find alternative suppliers of oil and other commodities. But leaders always have to think strategically. And there is no place for strong Russia in the future. Russia is getting weaker and weaker.
I want to cut across back to my colleague Geeta and Abhishek Bhalla, who are joining us. Abhishek from Ukraine, Geeta from Russia-occupied Ukraine. But Abhishek, we spoke to Geeta a short while ago, and I want to come to you as well. What's the kind of emotion that you're picking up? Because we just heard the tracks of both foreign ministers, one of Russia, one of Ukraine. All of this is also taking place in the backdrop of the Indian Prime Minister in Berlin. There's bound to be diplomatic pressure on him. There has been in the past as well of, possibly that to change India's neutral diplomatic line.
Well, the sense here, Preeti, is that yes, India should take a stand, and people expect a lot from India, be it officials or civilians that I have spoken to, and they are happy that, India's stand has throughout been that there needs to be peace and the war needs to stop, and they expect a lot from India. And one of the most interesting things that I've picked up is that, this logic that India has a long-standing relationship with Russia doesn't really hold, because the sense that people have is that they have a long-standing relationship with Soviet Russia and not just with Russia. So in that sense, they expect India to take a stand in favor of Ukraine. But obviously, there are diplomatic ties between India and the current Russia, and it's not going to be easy. But the fact that India has abstained even proposals put by Russia in the UN is something that the people here have taken very well. And as far as the fighting and the war is concerned, they are expecting India to take a stand, even though, India has not completely, gone against what Russia has said. But yes, there is a sense that India needs to change its neutral stand and tilt towards Ukraine.
All right, just stay on with me, Geeta and Abhishek. I'm going to come right back. Prime Minister Modi arrives in Berlin on the first leg of his three-nation Europe trip, which he will now hold bilateral discussions with German Chancellor and co-chair the Indian-German intergovernmental consultations. Now, from Berlin, Modi will travel to Copenhagen tomorrow, where he will have a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Frederiksen, during which the two leaders would review the progress in India's unique green strategic partnership with Denmark. On the 4th of May, he, during a brief stopover in Paris, will hold talks with newly re-elected French President Emmanuel Macron. Prime Minister Modi's three-nation tour comes in midst of Russia's relentless assault on Ukraine.
आपको बता दें कि जैसे प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी भी संबोधित करेंगे और उसके बाद जर्मन चांसलर
I want to cut across back to my colleague Geeta Mohan and our former Foreign Affairs editor. Geeta, how do you see this visit pan out? Because, the Prime Minister is going to go across to three nations. Do you see that there will be pressure possibly on him to make a public statement on what's going down in the East?
Well, certainly one thing I can say for sure, Preeti, is that there is a line that needs to be drawn. Thus far and no further. We know that Europe has tried to put enough pressure on India, and the stance has remained the same. A federal minister from Germany was in New Delhi ahead of Prime Minister's visit, and he very clearly said that we are not going to lecture India on Ukraine and Russia. We saw the same kind of conversation and messaging from the UK. So I suppose the European world has understood that there is no changing India's stand. All that can be done is we should look at and focus on what the joint statement will, how the joint statement will mention the Russia-Ukraine war, what India's position publicly is going to be in terms of a statement when they talk about, and it will only talk about cessation of violence and a negotiated settlement between the two sides. Beyond that, asking India to be a part or partake in the sanctions is certainly not something that Germany is going to do, because they have already said that they're not going to lecture India. They want India to take a stand, but that's not something that is on their agenda. India is a very important market, a very important partner country for Germany, and they would not want that compromised in this visit.
All right, appreciate Abhishek and Geeta for joining us. What's also interesting is, I would reckon, the narrative has already from India's side been set by our own Foreign Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, who made it very, very clear that this is the line which is who drew the proverbial line in the sand. With that, I want to cut across to the latest coming in. Prime Minister Modi, who arrived in Germany on the first leg of his 3-day tour, got a rousing welcome from the Indian diaspora. PM's Berlin visit started with meeting Indian diaspora in midst of chants of Modi and Vande Mataram. Prime Minister's interaction began with signing autographs, affectionate pats and obliging young fans. Many kids, along with their parents, were present at the hotel, waving hands, waving at the Prime Minister's arrival. Prime Minister also interacted with a little girl who presented him with a portrait of his picture and called him her icon. Later today, Prime Minister is scheduled to meet German Chancellor. The two leaders will co-chair the 6th edition of the India-German Intergovernmental Consultations.
मैं बोलूँगी कि मेरे को आज बहुत अच्छा लग रहा है क्योंकि मैं प्राइम मिनिस्टर से मिली, मोदी जी से, और मैंने जब उनको ये पेंटिंग दिखाई उन्होंने बोला शाबाश, और उन्होंने मेरे को ये सिग्नेचर दिया अपना, और उन्होंने अपने सिग्नेचर के ऊपर वंदे मातरम भी लिखा है, इसलिए मैं बहुत खुश हूँ।
आपको तो वंदे मातरम भी लिखा हुआ मिला है, वंदे मातरम नरेंद्र मोदी ऑटोग्राफ मिला।
हाँ, और मैंने उन्हें बोला कि यू आर माई आइकॉन, और मैं बहुत खुश हूँ कि आई एम प्राउड कि वो हमारे देश के प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी हैं।
हाँ। आपने बोला यू आर एन आइकॉन?
यस।
और उनका क्या रिस्पॉन्स था?
लाइक ही डिड लाइक दिस।
तो हाउ आर यू फीलिंग? अब आपके लिए कैसी खुशी है?
इट वाज लाइक माय ड्रीम केम ट्रू।
ये आपने खुद से बनाई है ना? तो ये कितने दिन में बनाई?
1 डे।
एक दिन में? मान्या मिश्रा, जय हिंद लिखा आपने? हाँ,
yes.
और फिर बना के और आज पीएम को दिखा दिया, तो मतलब जो काम जहाँ पहुँचना था वो हो गया।
यस, यस।
अब फीलिंग रिलीव्ड? अभी भी धड़कन तेज है?
यस।
धड़कन तेज है, एक्साइटेड स्टिल?
यस।
तो मान्या इज हैप्पी नाउ?
यस, यस।
चलिए, कुछ बोलना चाहेंगे आप जो इंडियंस देख रहे हैं उनको?
वंदे मातरम, जय हिंद।
डैड साहब भी बहुत खुश है, बेटी एकदम खूब मजा है आज बच्ची के साथ।
बहुत ऐसे राजा जो बहुत ही दयालु हैं और अपनी प्रजा के लिए सच में दिल से सोचते हैं, क्योंकि जो मोदी जी ने भारतवर्ष के लिए किया है उसको हैट्स ऑफ। और ये हम सबका एक सपना था यहाँ पे कि मोदी जी हमारे बीच में हैं आज, और भले ही ठीक है उनका बहुत शॉर्ट विजिट है, और लेकिन एक फीलिंग जो हम लोगों के अंदर पिछले 1 हफ्ते या 10 दिन से थी कि हम मोदी जी से मिलने वाले, जो एक्साइटमेंट हमारे अंदर था, आज वो एक सपना हमारा साकार हो गया मोदी जी से मिलके। ही इज एक्चुअली ट्रू प्राइम मिनिस्टर।
ये वो लोग हैं जो प्रधानमंत्री से मिलने के बाद जबरदस्त जोश में। कैसा है आप लोगों का जोश? अब बताइए, पीएम से मीटिंग कैसी रही?
बहुत बहुत अच्छी रही। पीएम मोदी ने सबको झुक के नमस्कार किया, और वो हमारे लिए बहुत बहुत बड़ा एक उत्साह भरा टाइम था, और हमें बाहर से मोदी की आवाजें, उत्साह इतना डबल हो गया कि हम अंदर से चिल्ला,
नारेबाजी कर रहे थे।
बिल्कुल, क्योंकि बाहर से सुनाई दिया, हमें समझ आ गया कि मोदी जी लैंड हो गए और अब आने वाले हैं, तो हमने भी अंदर शुरू कर दिया।
आपके लिए?
हम बहुत दिनों से तैयारी कर रहे हैं। जब मोदी जी आए, सबको मिले, हाय हेलो किया, किसी को पूछा कि कैसे हो आप, तो बहुत अच्छा लगा। मैंने उनको मराठी में बात की, उन्होंने रिप्लाई भी दिया।
क्या बोला आपने मराठी में?
मैं बोला की मोदी जी तुमचं बर्लिन मध्ये स्वागत आहे, तर ते म्हणले धन्यवाद मित्रा।
अच्छा, और आप मुझे बता, अंदर से सबसे ज्यादा नारे कौन लगा रहा था?
मोदी 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 मोदी।
पूरा एक्साइटमेंट रहा अंदर में?
बहुत एक्साइटमेंट तो बहुत था। मैं पुणे से आता हूँ, तो मैंने आके ही मैं पहले नंबर पे ही मैं था, तो आते ही मोदी जी ने मेरे पास हाथ बढ़ाया, तो हाथ बढ़ाया, मैंने बोला मोदी जी कसे आहात, तो मोदी जी ने बोला कि हाँ मस्त मजे, तुम भी कसे आहात। तो फिर हम, मेरे बाजू में और एक सिस्टर थी, तो उनसे पूछ रहे थे कि आप तो सुबह 3 बजे से यहाँ पे हो, बहुत ठंडी में, हाँ आप कैसे, अभी ठीक है क्या? तो हम लोग की भी काफी, उन लोगों ने बात की हम लोग से।
तो ये मिनी इंडिया क्या, मतलब हर जगह के लोग। और आप भी
थोड़ा लगाइए, माइक लगाइए, धड़कन कुछ सुनाई दे रही है। अभी तक इतनी धड़कन बढ़ी हुई है कि कुछ इसका सवाल ही नहीं है ना।
अभी तक धड़कन
तेज है,
और धड़कन तो 20 दिन से ही चल रही है।
वो भी सही बात है। यस, बहुत ही बढ़िया लगा। मतलब इट्स लाइक वंस इन अ लाइफ टाइम। पहले तो हम लोग 2015 में मिले थे उनसे, बट ये तो बहुत ही स्पेसिफिक रहा, बहुत ही बढ़िया।
गला बैठ गया है तो वो निशानी है सबसे ज्यादा।
लेकिन हाँ, आज का एनकाउंटर बहुत ही अच्छा था, बहुत नजदीक से था, और 2015 में भी मिले थे, बट आज वाला बहुत यूनिक था।
आपके लिए?
बहुत ही बढ़िया और वंस इन अ लाइफ टाइम
तो
अपॉर्चुनिटी।
धड़कन तेज हो गई है, बताइए अब कोई इलाज खोजिए मत।
हाँ मैं तो गिर
हमने आके उनकी मदद की क्योंकि हम 3 बजे से तैयार होके निकले हुए थे। 2 घंटे अंदर फोटो के लिए वेट किए और फिर जब वो आए तो लगा हम अभी से इतने तरोताजा हैं कि हम उनका पूरे लाइफ टाइम वेट कर सकते हैं।
अभी बताइए आप मिल पाए?
हाँ मिल पाए, हम एकदम सामने खड़े थे। आते बराबर मोदी जी ने कहा शुक्रिया आप लोग इतने सुबह से आए हुए हैं, तो हमें बहुत अच्छा लगा वो सुन के कि उन्हें भी पता है कि लोग कितने वेट कर रहे हैं उनका और उत्साहित है उनके लिए।
बिल्कुल जैसे वो हमारे तरफ आए और नमस्ते करके जो मोमेंट था, मतलब आई कैन
और ढोल, आप ढोल बजाने वाले हैं तो ढोल में इनके अब ज्यादा जोश होगा, पूरा ढोल ताशा है इंटू 200 पावर।
हम लोग रात भर सोए नहीं है, ओनली विद द थॉट ऑफ दैट 1 मिनट झलक ऑफ उनकी, और इतना एनर्जी, इतना पॉजिटिव, इतना कैरिस्मेटिक पर्सनालिटी है उनका, वी कैन नॉट गेट ओवर इट।